January 17th, 1945. Fort Carson, Colorado. The wind howled across the high desert plateau with a violence that seemed to strip the very color from the sky. Inside the prisoner of war hospital ward, an Italian soldier named Giuseppe Moretti lay motionless beneath 3 wool blankets, his feet elevated on pillows stuffed with cotton batting. He was 23 years old. His toes had turned the color of charcoal, black at the tips, mottled purple toward the base. The flesh had gone numb weeks ago, somewhere in the mountains of Tunisia, but the pain had arrived later, a deep throbbing ache that felt like his bones were being crushed from the inside. He had not walked in 47 days. Through the frost-rimmed window beside his cot, he could see American soldiers moving across the compound in heavy boots, their breath forming white clouds in the mountain air. He watched them with the detached fascination of a man who had forgotten what it meant to stand. The nurse who changed his dressings each morning was named Margaret Callahan. She was 31 years old, a captain in the Army Nurse Corps, and she moved through the ward with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to measure tragedy in increments small enough to bear. When she unwrapped the bandages from Moretti's feet, the smell of dying tissue filled the space between them. Sweet and rotten, unmistakable. She did not flinch. She had smelled worse in the field hospitals of North Africa, in the aid stations of Sicily where the wounded arrived in trucks that left trails of blood in the sand. But something about this particular soldier troubled her in ways she could not name. Perhaps it was his youth, or the way he stared at the ceiling with eyes that had already accepted their verdict. Perhaps it was simply that winter morning, that particular quality of light through frozen glass, that made her think of her brother Thomas, who had died at Anzio 11 months earlier. His body never recovered from the muddy shore. Giuseppe Moretti had not expected to end up in an American prison camp in the Rocky Mountains. He had not expected to survive at all. When he enlisted in Mussolini's army in 1940, the propaganda posters had shown Italian soldiers marching triumphantly through palm-lined streets, restoring the glory of Rome across the Mediterranean. The Duce had promised them empire. He had promised them victory that would be swift and absolute, a new Pax Romana that would make their ancestors proud. Moretti had been 17 then, a farm boy from outside Salerno who had never seen the sea, despite growing up 20 kilometers from its shore. The uniform had made him feel taller. The rifle had made him feel dangerous. He had believed with the fervent certainty of the young that he was marching toward greatness. Instead, he had marched toward Tunisia, toward the bitter winter of 1942, when the German and Italian forces found themselves trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army and the American II Corps, the mountains offering no shelter, the supply lines collapsing like severed arteries. Moretti remembered the cold more than the combat. He remembered how the leather of his boots had cracked in the frost, how his socks, thin cotton things that had been issued in Naples, had disintegrated against his skin. He remembered taking off his boots one night in a cave hollowed from limestone and seeing that 2 of his toes had turned white, the flesh hard as candle wax. His sergeant had laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Better white than red," the man had said. "White you might keep. Red means the gangrene's already eating you alive." By the time the Axis forces surrendered in May 1943, Moretti could no longer feel his feet at all. The American medics who processed the prisoners at the collection point near Bizerte had taken one look at his condition and marked him for immediate evacuation. He had been transported by hospital ship to Naples, then by train to a field hospital in Casablanca, then by another ship across the Atlantic to a naval hospital in Maryland. The frostbite had been assessed as 4th degree, penetrating through skin and tissue into bone. The recommendation had been amputation below the ankle, bilateral. But the Italian POW surgeons, fellow prisoners who staffed the medical facilities, had argued for delay, for observation, for the possibility that blood flow might return to the damaged tissue. They had bought him time. They had also bought him pain that felt like his feet were being held over an open flame, a phantom burning that no morphine could fully extinguish. And so Giuseppe Moretti had been transferred to Fort Carson, to the high altitude of Colorado where the air was thin and clean, where the American military maintained one of its largest prisoner of war complexes. 15,000 men lived behind the wire there. Germans, Italians, a few Japanese, working in labor details, attending classes, waiting for a war to end that had already ended for them. The Italian prisoners were housed separately from the Germans, a concession to the complicated politics of Italy's surrender and co-belligerence. Some of the Italians had sworn loyalty oaths to the Allied cause. Others remained loyal to Mussolini's puppet republic in the north. Most simply wanted to survive long enough to go home. Moretti belonged to this last category. He had no particular ideology left. The cold had frozen it out of him. What struck him most about America was not its size, though the scale of everything staggered him. The endless plains visible from the train windows, the mountains that dwarfed the Apennines, but its abundance. The prison camp fed them better than his own army ever had. Breakfast was oatmeal with brown sugar and dried fruit, eggs some mornings, bread that was soft and white. Lunch brought sandwiches of meat and cheese, soup thick with vegetables, apples that were crisp and sweet. Dinner meant potatoes, beef, or pork, green beans cooked in butter. There was coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute he had drunk in Tunisia. There was milk, cold from refrigeration units that hummed through the night. The portions were not generous by American standards, but they were astronomical by the standards of the Regio Esercito, where a soldier's daily ration near the end had consisted of stale bread and thin soup flavored with carrot peels. The German prisoners complained about the food. Moretti heard them through the fence that separated the compounds, their voices carrying across the frozen ground in the evening. They wanted darker bread, more sausage, beer. They wanted the food of home. The Italians did not complain. They ate with the quiet intensity of men who remembered hunger, who understood that this plenty was temporary, that the world they had known was a world of scarcity that would return the moment they crossed back over the ocean. Moretti ate lying down, his meals brought to him on a tray because he could not walk to the mess hall. He ate methodically, slowly, making each bite last. The taste of butter in particular fascinated him. He had never eaten real butter before the Americans, only the olive oil and lard of southern Italy, and this sweet yellow substance seemed like something from a fairy tale, proof of a prosperity so vast it could afford to spread its wealth on bread. But he could not walk. And in a prison camp where men were valued for their labor capacity, where work details determined privileges and purpose, immobility was a kind of death. The doctors visited him twice a week, American doctors, not prisoners, and each time they examined his feet with instruments that looked like tools for gardening, probing the dead tissue, checking for signs of infection spreading upward into the living flesh. They spoke to each other in medical terminology he did not understand, their voices clinical and detached. Once the older doctor had turned to him and spoken in careful English. "We may still need to amputate. Do you understand? Take off the feet. To save the legs." Moretti had understood. He had nodded. What else could he do? A man without feet was still a man. A man dead from gangrene was nothing. Margaret Callahan had overheard that conversation. She had been checking the chart of the patient in the next bed, a German submariner who had contracted pneumonia, but her attention had drifted to the Italian boy with the dying feet. She had seen many amputations in her 18 months of military service. She had assisted at surgeries where legs came off at the knee, arms at the shoulder, the discarded limbs piled in metal basins like offerings to some terrible god. She had learned to separate her emotional response from her professional duty, to see bodies as mechanical systems that sometimes required parts removed to preserve the whole. But something about this case unsettled her. Perhaps it was the preventability of it. Frostbite was not a bullet wound, not shrapnel, not the random cruelty of high explosives. It was the result of poor equipment, inadequate supply, the institutional neglect that had characterized Italy's war effort from the beginning. Or perhaps it was the boots. The Italian prisoners wore boots issued by the American military, plain brown leather work boots, sturdy and functional, sized appropriately and maintained adequately. They were far better than the boots Moretti had worn in Africa, better than most of the boots worn by Italian soldiers throughout the war. But they were, in a sense, too late. The damage had already been done. When she saw the prisoners marching to their work details in the morning, their American boots crunching through the snow, she thought about timing, about how history pivoted on such small logistical details. If Italy had equipped its soldiers with proper cold weather gear, how many thousands of men would still have their feet, their fingers, their ears? How many would have survived? The question was unanswerable, but it haunted her nonetheless. Her brother Thomas had been killed at Anzio on January 30th, 1944, exactly 1 year and 17 days before this moment. He had been a sergeant in the 3rd Infantry Division, 28 years old, married with a daughter he had never met, born 3 weeks after he shipped out. The telegram had arrived at her parents' home in Philadelphia on a Tuesday afternoon in February. Margaret had been overseas when it happened, stationed at a field hospital in England, preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. She had not been able to attend the funeral. She had not been able to hold her mother while the old woman wept, or comfort her sister-in-law, or see the folded flag presented with ceremonial precision. She had received a letter from her father instead. 3 paragraphs written in the careful handwriting of a man who worked as an accountant, who believed that numbers and order could contain grief. Thomas died instantly, the letter had said, as if the speed of death made it more bearable. He did not suffer. She had not believed it then. She did not believe it now. Everyone suffered. The boots he had worn were somewhere in Italy, probably buried in the mud of the beachhead, or burned with other refuse, or claimed by some other soldier who needed them more than a dead man did. Before he shipped out, Thomas had bought the best boots he could afford, good civilian hiking boots made by a company in Maine, broken in carefully over weeks of training. He had written to her about them in his letters, how they had held up through the landing in Sicily, through the march up the Italian peninsula, through the rain and cold of that terrible winter. "These boots might save my life," he had written in December. They had not, but they had outlasted him. After his death, the family had received his personal effects in a cardboard box. Letters, photographs, a watch that had stopped at 217, a pocket Bible, a wallet containing $5, and a picture of his wife. The boots had not been included. They were military necessity, not personal sentiment. Margaret kept one of Thomas's letters in the pocket of her uniform. She carried it with her through her shifts, a talisman against the endless procession of wounded men who all blurred together if she was not careful, if she did not maintain some thread connecting her to a specific grief, a specific memory. The letter was dated December 3rd, 1943. In it, Thomas had described a village near Cassino where his unit had been billeted for 3 days, a rare respite from the fighting. An Italian woman had given him fresh bread, he wrote, still warm from the oven. She had not spoken English. He had not spoken Italian, but she had pressed the bread into his hands and made the sign of the cross over his forehead, and he had understood that she was blessing him, or praying for him, or perhaps simply acknowledging their shared humanity in a landscape gone mad. "I keep thinking about that bread," he had written. "It tasted like someone's home, like someone still believed the world could be good." On the morning of February 3rd, Margaret Callahan made her usual rounds through the POW hospital ward. She checked pulses, administered medications, changed dressings, recorded vital signs in charts that would be filed and forgotten. When she reached Giuseppe Moretti's bed, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the same empty expression he wore every morning. His fever had broken during the night, a good sign indicating the infection had not spread. But his feet looked worse. The blackened tissue had begun to separate from the living flesh, creating a clear demarcation line that the surgeons would use to guide their scalpels. Without intervention, his body would eventually shed the dead tissue naturally, a process called autoamputation that could take months and risked sepsis. The surgical option was faster, cleaner, more certain. It was also irreversible. She knelt beside the bed and began unwrapping the bandages, the familiar routine of wound care occupying her hands while her mind wandered. Through the window, morning light slanted across the snow, turning the landscape into a study in white and gold. A radio somewhere in the ward was playing Glenn Miller, the sound tinny and distant. "Moonlight Serenade." Thomas had loved that song. He had danced to it at his wedding, his new wife in his arms, both of them young and convinced of their invincibility. Margaret had been there, maid of honor in a blue dress, catching the bouquet she had no intention of using. She had been 29 then, already considered an old maid by the standards of her neighborhood, already committed to a career that left little room for the domestic life her mother had imagined for her. "Nurse?" Moretti's voice was soft, his English heavily accented but comprehensible. He had been learning from the other prisoners, from the classes offered by the camp education program, from the guards who sometimes chatted with the Italians during cigarette breaks. "My feet, they are gone? Finish?" She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. They were brown, she noticed, a deep walnut brown that reminded her of the old furniture in her grandmother's house. Young eyes still, despite everything they had seen. "Not yet," she said. "The doctors will make that decision soon. Maybe this week." He nodded slowly, processing this information. "Is okay," he said. "I understand. Better no feet than no life." The resignation in his voice struck her like a physical blow. This was what war did, she thought. It taught men to accept the unacceptable, to measure tragedy on a sliding scale where losing your feet ranked as a fortunate outcome. How many men in this hospital would have traded places with Moretti? The German in the next bed who had lost both legs to a torpedo blast? The American soldier 2 wards over whose face had been burned away by a flamethrower, who would never look at himself in a mirror without seeing a monster? Moretti would keep his legs. He would keep his life. In the arithmetic of wartime suffering, he was lucky, but luck was relative. And Margaret found herself thinking about the boots in her footlocker. The boots that had arrived 6 weeks ago in a package from her sister-in-law. "I can't bear to look at them anymore," the enclosed letter had explained. "Thomas would want someone to use them. Someone who needs them. I thought maybe in your hospital, maybe someone—" The sentence had trailed off, unable to articulate the hope that giving away a dead man's boots might somehow redeem his death, might transform it from meaningless loss into purposeful sacrifice. Margaret had not known what to do with them. She could not give them to an American soldier. That felt wrong somehow, like replacing Thomas with a substitute. She could not throw them away. They were too valuable, too solid, too much a part of her brother. So they had remained in her footlocker, wrapped in the brown paper they had arrived in, waiting for a purpose she could not define. Until now, until this moment, kneeling beside an Italian prisoner whose feet were dying, whose future had narrowed to a choice between amputation or infection, whose crime had been to believe Mussolini's lies and march into mountains without adequate equipment. The logic was complicated. Thomas had died fighting against the Italian army, against the forces that Moretti had belonged to. By the calculations of war, they were enemies. But Italy had surrendered. Moretti was no longer an enemy combatant, but a prisoner of war, protected by the Geneva Conventions, entitled to the same medical care as American soldiers. And more than that, he was 23 years old, a farm boy who had never wanted empire, who had simply worn the uniform he was handed and followed orders until the cold broke him. She finished wrapping the bandages and stood up, her knees protesting the movement. At 31, she already felt old, worn down by the cumulative weight of other people's suffering. "I'll check on you this evening," she said. Moretti nodded, already drifting back into the semi-conscious state he inhabited most days, a twilight of pain medication and exhaustion. Margaret moved on to the next bed, the next patient, the next set of wounds that needed tending. But her mind remained fixed on the boots in her footlocker, and on a question she could not quite formulate. What did she owe the dead? What did the dead owe the living? That evening, after her shift ended, she sat in the small room she shared with another nurse and stared at the brown paper package. The boots inside were size 10, American measurement. Large, but Thomas had been a tall man, broad-shouldered and strong. They would be too big for Moretti, she was certain. She had seen his feet, had measured them in her mind against the chart specifications. He was perhaps size 8, maybe 8.5, but too large was better than too small. Too large could be compensated with extra socks. Too large could be tightened with adjusted laces. Too large meant room for bandages, for the swelling that would come as damaged tissue healed, for the uncertain future of feet that might yet be saved. The decision, once made, felt inevitable. She unwrapped the package and removed the boots, holding them in her hands like sacred objects. They were scuffed and mud-stained, bearing the evidence of their journey through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula. The leather had been oiled recently, probably by her sister-in-law, preparing them for shipment, maintaining them out of habit or love or grief. The laces were frayed but intact. The soles showed wear but remained solid, the tread still visible. Good boots! Boots made to last. Boots that had carried Thomas through 7 months of combat, and might have carried him through 7 more if the war had been kind, if history had bent differently, if the shell that killed him had landed 3 feet to the left or right, or not at all. She placed them back in the paper and tied the package with string. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, trying to explain what she was about to do, trying to find words that would make sense of the impulse driving her. "Dear Catherine," she wrote, "I've found someone who needs Thomas's boots. An Italian prisoner in my ward who will lose his feet without them. I know this might seem strange. I know Thomas died fighting against the Italians. But the war has moved past these distinctions. And this boy, he's just a boy really, had nothing to do with Thomas's death. He's a victim of the same forces that killed our brother, the same stupidity and cruelty that sent men to die in the cold without proper equipment. I think Thomas would understand. I think he would want his boots to save someone, even if that someone wore a different uniform. I hope you can forgive me if I'm wrong." She never sent the letter. In the morning, she found herself crumpling it up and throwing it into the waste bin beside her desk. Some things could not be explained, only done. Some decisions existed beyond the reach of justification. She wrapped the boots in a clean towel and carried them to the hospital ward, arriving before the morning shift change when the ward was quiet and the supervising physician had not yet begun his rounds. Moretti was awake, lying motionless beneath his blankets, watching the dawn light creep across the far wall. He did not notice her approach until she was standing beside his bed. "I brought you something," she said quietly. She unwrapped the boots and set them on the chair beside his cot. "They're too big, but we can add extra socks. When your feet heal enough to try walking again, you'll need proper boots. These are proper boots." Moretti stared at them with an expression she could not read. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief, or the careful neutrality of a prisoner who had learned not to show too much emotion. He reached out slowly and touched the leather, his fingers tracing the lines of wear, the places where the boots had creased and flexed with the shape of someone else's foot. "These are American boots," he said. "Good boots? Expensive boots?" "Why you give to me?" Margaret had prepared several answers to this question. She had rehearsed them in her mind during the sleepless hours of the previous night. She could tell him about medical necessity, about how proper footwear would aid his recovery, about the practical benefits of well-made boots. She could tell him about the surplus of equipment, about how American abundance meant these boots were not particularly valuable, not worth keeping. She could tell him nothing, simply deflect the question with professional distance. But standing there in the gray morning light, looking at this young man who had been broken by his own country's failures, she found herself telling the truth. "They belonged to my brother," she said. "He was killed in Italy, at Anzio. He doesn't need them anymore. And you do." The silence that followed felt vast, a chasm opening between them that contained all the complexity of their situation, the accident of their meeting, the history that had brought them both to this Colorado hospital, the thousands of small decisions and chances that had resulted in Thomas Callahan dying on an Italian beach, while Giuseppe Moretti lived to become a prisoner in an American camp. Moretti's eyes filled with tears. He did not try to hide them or wipe them away. They simply spilled down his cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am sorry for your brother. I am sorry for the war. I am sorry I cannot walk to thank you properly." "Don't be sorry," Margaret said, her voice rougher than she intended. "Just heal. That's all. Just heal enough to wear them." Might? Perhaps? Possibly? The language of medical uncertainty. But Moretti heard only the word survive, and his face transformed with something that looked like hope, that fragile emotion that war worked so hard to extinguish. Margaret watched from across the ward, maintaining professional distance, but she felt something shift in her chest, some knot of grief loosening slightly. The boots sat on the chair beside Moretti's bed, waiting. They had become more than footwear. They had become a promise, a symbol of a future that might still contain walking, working, returning to the farm outside. Salerno, where Moretti's mother grew tomatoes in volcanic soil and his father tended olive trees that were older than Rome. The weeks that followed marked Moretti's transformation from dying patient to recovering prisoner. The blackened tissue of his toes fell away naturally, leaving raw pink flesh that wept clear fluid and smelled of healing rather than rot. The doctors debrided the wounds, removing the last traces of dead tissue, and applied new bandages that needed changing only once a day instead of 3 times. Moretti's appetite increased. His color improved. He began doing exercises in bed, lifting his legs, flexing his ankles, preparing his body for the day when standing might again be possible. The other patients in the ward watched his recovery with the peculiar interest of men who needed to believe in healing, who needed evidence that damaged bodies could be repaired, that the war's alterations were not always permanent. In mid-March, 8 weeks after Margaret had given him the boots, Moretti stood for the first time. The physical therapist supported him on one side, a male nurse on the other, and he placed his bandaged feet on the cold floor with the tentativeness of a man learning to walk on broken glass. The pain was immediate and intense, shooting up his legs like electric current, but he could feel it. That was the crucial thing. He could feel the floor, could sense the pressure distribution, could make his muscles respond to his brain's commands. He stood for 15 seconds before the pain became overwhelming, then collapsed back onto the bed, gasping and sweating but grinning with an expression of pure triumph. "We'll try again tomorrow," the physical therapist said. "Little by little. Your feet need to remember how to bear weight." "Tomorrow," Moretti agreed. "And tomorrow. And tomorrow." He was quoting something, Shakespeare perhaps, though he did not know it was Shakespeare. The Italian prisoners had put on a production of Macbeth in the camp theater the previous month, translated into Italian, performed with costumes sewn from prison-issue clothing. Moretti had not attended. He had been confined to the hospital ward, but he had heard about it from the other patients, how the German prisoners had complained about the noise, how the American guards had stood at the back of the theater watching with expressions that ranged from amusement to bewilderment. The tomorrow speech had resonated through the camp for weeks afterward, prisoners quoting it to each other in Italian, in German, in broken English. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. The words of a defeated king seemed appropriate for defeated soldiers. By April, Moretti could stand for 5 minutes. By May, he could walk 10 steps with support. By June, he could cross the ward unassisted, his gait unsteady and painful but functional. The boots remained on the chair beside his bed, waiting. They were too valuable to wear for practice walking. The camp-issue shoes were sufficient for that, cheap canvas things that would fall apart within months, but served adequately for short distances. The boots were being saved for something more significant, though neither Moretti nor Margaret spoke about what that might be. They had fallen into a careful pattern of interaction that maintained professional boundaries while acknowledging an unspoken connection. She changed his dressings. He thanked her in his improving English. She asked about his pain levels. He answered honestly. Neither mentioned the boots or Thomas or Anzio or the strangeness of their situation. The doctors came 2 days later and examined Moretti's feet with their usual clinical detachment. They conferred in low voices at the foot of his bed, checking charts, comparing notes, performing the mysterious calculations of medical science. Finally, the older doctor turned to Moretti with an expression that might have been surprise or satisfaction or simple professional interest. "We're going to wait," he announced. The infection has stabilized. There's blood flow in the tissue we thought was dead. Not much, but enough. We'll wait another 2 weeks and reassess. If the improvement continues, you might keep your feet. Most of your feet anyway. You'll lose the toes. But the feet themselves, the part that matters for walking, that might survive. On the morning of June 15, 1945, the war in Europe having been over for 5 weeks, the Pacific War grinding toward its own apocalyptic conclusion, Margaret Callahan entered the hospital ward and found Giuseppe Moretti standing beside his bed, fully dressed in his prison uniform, the boots on his feet. They were laced tightly, the excess length of the laces wrapped around the ankle and tied in double knots. He wore 3 pairs of socks. The boots still looked slightly large, but they no longer looked absurd. They looked functional, purposeful. He was standing straight, bearing his full weight, his expression a mixture of pain and pride. "I am walking today," he announced. "Outside, I have permission. The doctor says I must exercise. I must build the strength." He paused, then added with careful formality, "I will wear your brother's boots with honor. I will not let them touch mud if I can help it. I will walk carefully." Margaret felt something break inside her chest, some final barrier between her professional self and her grieving self. She had spent 18 months constructing that barrier, learning to separate the nurse who tended wounds from the sister who mourned her brother, the soldier who served her country from the woman who questioned the cost of that service. The barrier had protected her, had allowed her to function in circumstances that would have destroyed her otherwise. But it had also isolated her, had kept her locked in a grief that could not evolve or transform or find any meaning beyond loss. "Walk wherever you want," she said, her voice unsteady. "They're your boots now." He would want them to touch the ground. He would want them to be used. Moretti nodded, understanding more than she had said, hearing the permission she was granting herself as much as him. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his movements stiff and cautious but increasingly confident. He walked down the center aisle of the ward, past the rows of beds containing German sailors and Italian soldiers, and the occasional Japanese prisoner, men who had fought for empires that no longer existed, ideologies that had been consumed in the fire of their own ambitions. He walked through the ward door and into the corridor beyond. Margaret watched him go, this boy who had believed Mussolini's lies and paid for them with his feet, who had been fed by his enemies, and healed by their medicine, and given boots by the sister of a man his army had helped to kill. The symbolism was almost too perfect, she thought, almost too neat. The boots became a bridge between enemies, a gesture of reconciliation, a sign that humanity could survive even the most brutal of wars. But the reality was messier than symbolism. The boots did not bring Thomas back. They did not undo Anzio or Tunisia or any of the 1,000 battlefields where men had died for reasons they did not fully understand. They were simply boots, worn and scuffed and too large, given by one person to another in a moment of impulse that might have been compassion or grief, or the desperate need to believe that something good could come from something terrible. Over the following months, Moretti wore the boots every day. He wore them on work details where Italian prisoners repaired roads and painted buildings and harvested crops from the fertile fields outside the camp. He wore them in the education classes where prisoners studied English and mathematics and vocational skills meant to prepare them for whatever future awaited after repatriation. He wore them during the evening hours when the prisoners gathered in the recreation yard, playing soccer with a ball made of rags, singing songs from home, writing letters to families they had not seen in years. The boots held up remarkably well, testament to the main company that had crafted them, to American manufacturing prowess, to a prosperity that could afford to make things that lasted. The German prisoners noticed the boots. They were too distinctive to miss, too obviously American civilian goods rather than military issue. Some of the Germans muttered about favoritism, about the Italians receiving special treatment because they had surrendered, because they had switched sides, because they were no longer considered real enemies. A few of the more fanatical prisoners, the ones who still believed in Hitler, who still spoke of eventual German victory, accused Moretti of collaboration, of betraying the Axis cause by accepting American gifts. Moretti ignored them. He had long since stopped caring about ideological purity or political loyalty. He cared about his feet, which still hurt every morning when he woke up, which would probably hurt for the rest of his life, but which functioned well enough to carry him from place to place, to allow him to work and move and eventually go home. The Italian prisoners understood the boots differently. They saw them as evidence of American generosity, proof that the rumors they had heard were true, that America was a land of such abundance that even its dead could afford to give away possessions that would be treasured as luxuries in Italy. Many of the Italian prisoners had developed a complicated relationship with their captivity, recognizing that they ate better and lived more comfortably as prisoners in America than they had as soldiers in their own army. Some spoke of remaining in America after the war, of immigrating legally, of bringing their families to this land of plenty. Others dismissed such talk as fantasy, insisting that Italy was home regardless of its poverty, that family and language and culture mattered more than material comfort. But all of them noticed what the Americans threw away: perfectly good clothing, half-eaten meals, tools that only needed minor repairs. They noticed the waste inherent in abundance, the casual disregard for things that would be carefully preserved in a culture of scarcity. Moretti fell somewhere between these positions. He did not want to stay in America. He wanted to return to Salerno, to the farm where his parents waited, to the life he had left at 17. But he recognized that he was returning as a different person, carrying different knowledge. He had learned that Mussolini's promises of empire had been delusions, that Italy had never possessed the industrial capacity or military strength to compete with nations like America. He had learned that the propaganda about soft, pleasure-loving Americans who would crumble before the martial spirit of fascism had been grotesque lies. The Americans were not soft. They were simply rich, and richness provided advantages that spirit could not overcome. An army whose soldiers had adequate boots would always defeat an army whose soldiers' feet froze in the mountains. An economy that could manufacture tanks and planes and ships by the thousands would always overwhelm an economy that could barely feed its own population. These were bitter lessons, made more bitter by the knowledge that they had been learned too late, after hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers had already died or been crippled or captured. Moretti thought often about the men he had served with in Tunisia, wondering how many had survived, how many had died of wounds or cold or disease, how many had lost limbs to frostbite worse than his own. He thought about his sergeant who had laughed about white toes, who had been killed by a British artillery shell 3 days before the surrender. His body never recovered. He thought about the lieutenant who had commanded his company, a nobleman from Milan who had believed in the fascist project with genuine fervor, who had shot himself in the head the morning they received orders to surrender rather than face the disgrace of captivity. So much death, so much pointless death, and yet he was alive. He was walking. He wore boots that had belonged to an American soldier who had died fighting against the army Moretti had belonged to, and this circularity felt like some kind of meaning, though he could not articulate exactly what that meaning was. Perhaps it was simply evidence that life continued, that the living eventually inherited what the dead left behind, that objects outlasted the purposes they were created for. The boots had been made to protect Thomas Callahan's feet during combat. They had failed at that purpose, not through any defect in the boots themselves, but because a shell had ended their wearer's life before his feet needed further protection. Now they protected Moretti's damaged feet, allowing him to walk when he should have been crippled. They had found a new purpose. They had adapted to new circumstances. In this sense, they were more resilient than the ideologies that had started the war, the grand visions of empire and racial destiny that had collapsed into rubble and mass graves. Margaret Callahan watched Moretti's recovery with professional satisfaction and personal relief. She had not been certain the boots would help. She had not been certain of her own motivations in giving them. But seeing him walk across the compound, seeing his gradual return to functionality, she felt that she had done something right, something that honored Thomas's memory better than keeping the boots locked in a footlocker, untouched and unused. Her brother had been a practical man, a sergeant who understood logistics, who knew that equipment existed to be used, not preserved. He would have approved, she thought. He would have seen the sense in it. She wrote to her sister-in-law finally in August, as the war in the Pacific ended with atomic fire, and the camp began preparing for the eventual repatriation of its prisoners. She told Catherine about Moretti, about the frostbite, about the boots. She tried to explain her reasoning, though she knew it would sound strange, possibly even offensive. "I gave Thomas's boots to an Italian prisoner," she wrote. "He would have lost his feet without them. I know this might upset you. I know you might feel I had no right. But I kept thinking about Thomas at that village near Cassino, about the Italian woman who gave him bread and blessed him. I kept thinking that maybe this is what we're supposed to do. Feed each other, clothe each other, help each other survive. Even when we're supposed to be enemies. Maybe especially then." Catherine's response arrived 3 weeks later, forwarded through the military postal system. It was shorter than Margaret had expected. Just a single paragraph. "I understand," Catherine wrote. "Thomas would have understood too. He always said the war was not against the Italian people, only against the government that had led them astray. If his boots saved someone, then something good came from his death. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for caring enough to think about what he would want." In September 1945, the War Department announced that Italian prisoners of war would begin repatriation in October, with the process expected to take several months. The prisoners received the news with mixed emotions. They wanted to go home. Of course, they wanted to go home, but they also knew they were returning to a country devastated by war, occupied by foreign armies, stripped of its colonies and much of its territory, its economy in ruins, its political future uncertain. The Allies had formally declared Italy a co-belligerent nation after the surrender, but this status did not erase the damage of 3 years of fighting on Italian soil. Rome might not have been destroyed like Berlin or Tokyo, but much of southern Italy had been reduced to rubble. The towns along the Gothic line bombed and shelled into oblivion. The infrastructure of bridges and roads and railways systematically demolished. Moretti received his repatriation notice on October 3rd. He would be leaving Fort Carson on October 18th, transported by train to New York, then by ship to Naples, expected arrival in early November. He had 60 days to prepare, to gather the few possessions he had accumulated during his captivity, to say goodbye to the men he had lived alongside for 2 years. The camp allowed prisoners to take personal clothing with them, within reason: 1 pair of boots, 1 coat, items that would help them survive the Italian winter. The boots obviously would come with him. They were his now, not by theft, but by gift. Legitimately acquired, documented in the property records maintained by the camp administration. He wanted to thank Margaret properly before leaving, but he did not know how. The relationship between nurse and patient operated within strict boundaries, and he was uncertain what was permitted, what would be considered appropriate. Finally, he asked one of the Italian prisoner doctors for advice. The man, a surgeon from Bologna who had been captured in Tunisia, who would also be repatriated in November, suggested a letter. "Write her a letter," the doctor said. "Explain what the boots meant to you, what they allowed you to do. Americans value such things, these expressions of gratitude. It will mean more to her than you know." So Moretti wrote a letter in his careful English, working on it over several evenings, revising and correcting with help from the other prisoners who had better language skills. The final version was short, simple, free of the eloquence he wished he could command. "Dear Nurse Callahan, I am leaving soon to Italy. I want to thank you for the boots you give me. Because of the boots, I can walk. Because I can walk, I can work. Because I can work, I can live. When I arrive at my home in Salerno, I will tell my mother and father about the American nurse who give me boots that belong to her brother. I will tell them that Americans are people of great generosity, that they help even their enemies when those enemies are suffering. I will remember your brother Thomas who died in my country. I will pray for him. I will pray for you. I will wear the boots with honor until they are broken, and then I will keep them still as a memory of kindness in a time of war. With respect and gratitude, Giuseppe Moretti." He gave the letter to Margaret on October 17th, his last full day in the camp. She read it standing in the hospital ward while he waited, his expression nervous, uncertain of her reaction. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her uniform, next to the space where Thomas's letter had been, which she no longer needed to carry because its words had been absorbed into her memory, into her bones. She looked at Moretti for a long moment, this young man who had survived when so many had not, who would carry a piece of Thomas back to Italy, who had become an unexpected vehicle for her grief, to transform into something other than pure loss. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Walk carefully. Live well. That's the best way to honor him. To live well." Moretti nodded. He wanted to say more, to express the complicated gratitude he felt, to explain that the boots were more than just footwear, that they represented everything he had learned about America, about abundance and generosity, and the strange ways that enemies could become something else when circumstances shifted. But his English was inadequate to the task, and perhaps no language would have been sufficient. So he simply said, "I will live well. I promise this." The next morning, he boarded a train with 400 other Italian prisoners, all of them carrying duffel bags and wearing their American-issue clothing, all of them heading east toward the coast, toward the ships that would carry them home. Moretti wore the boots for the journey, feeling their familiar weight, their solid protection. His feet still hurt. They would always hurt, the doctors had told him. Nerve damage from the frostbite would persist for life. But the pain was manageable, tolerable, a small price for mobility. He watched Colorado pass by the train windows, the mountains giving way to plains, the plains stretching endlessly toward a horizon that seemed to promise everything and nothing. In New York, the prisoners were processed through a military embarkation center, their documents checked, their health assessed one final time, their belongings inventoried. A young clerk looked at Moretti's boots and whistled appreciatively. "Nice boots," he said. "American-made. Good quality. You get those at the PX?" Moretti did not know what a PX was, but he understood the question. "A gift," he said carefully, "from the nurse. At hospital." The clerk nodded and marked something on his form. "You're lucky," he said. "Italian boots are shit. These'll last you years." The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was a converted troop transport, crowded and uncomfortable, but adequate. The Italian prisoners clustered on deck during the day, watching the ocean pass, smoking cigarettes that were suddenly precious again because they would not be easily replaced in Italy, talking about what they would find when they arrived. Many had not received letters from their families in months. The Italian postal system had collapsed during the civil war between Mussolini's Repubblica Sociale and the Allied-backed government in the South. The prisoners did not know if their houses still stood, if their families had survived the fighting and the reprisals and the hunger. They were sailing toward uncertainty, toward a country that existed more in memory than in current reality. Moretti stood at the rail and thought about his father's olive trees, wondering if they had survived. Olive trees were resilient. They could live for centuries, could survive drought and neglect and even fire. But armies were hard on trees. Soldiers cut them for firewood when they were cold. Artillery fire shattered them. Tanks crushed them. He remembered the olive groves outside Tunis, ancient trees that had produced oil since Roman times, reduced to splintered stumps by the fighting. He tried not to imagine the same fate for his father's trees, but the imagination was difficult to control. The ship docked in Naples on November 8, 1945. The harbor was busy with military traffic, American supply ships unloading food and medicine and construction materials, Italian fishing boats trying to resume their trade. The city beyond the docks looked both familiar and alien. The same architecture, the same mountains in the background, but scarred now by bombing. Whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the population visibly thinner, more desperate than Moretti remembered. The prisoners disembarked and were processed through a repatriation center, given documents that certified their status, provided with temporary ration cards that would allow them to draw from Allied supplies until they could return to their home communities. Moretti made his way south along the coast road, sometimes walking, sometimes catching rides on military trucks or civilian carts. moving through a landscape that bore the marks of war like scars on skin. Bridges were destroyed, towns were gutted, fields that should have been planted lay fallow, the farmers dead or displaced or simply lacking the tools and seed to resume cultivation. But the land itself remained, the volcanic soil rich and dark, the climate mild and generous, the sun bright overhead. Italy had been defeated, occupied, dismembered, but it had not been destroyed. It would recover. It would take years, perhaps decades, but it would recover. He arrived at his family's farm 3 days after landing in Naples, walking the final kilometers up the hill road as evening fell. The house was still standing, smoke rising from the chimney. The olive trees remained, though several showed damage from shell fragments, their trunks scarred but alive. His mother was drawing water from the well when she saw him, and she dropped the bucket and screamed, a sound of pure joy that brought his father running from the barn. They embraced him with desperate intensity, touching his face, his arms, his chest, verifying that he was real, that he had survived, that he had come home. That night, sitting at the kitchen table eating bread and thin soup, the best his mother could provide, given the scarcity of food, Moretti told them about America, about the prison camp in the mountains, about the frostbite that had nearly cost him his feet, about the boots. His mother wept when he told her about Margaret Callahan, about the nurse whose brother had died at Anzio, who had given him boots that had saved his ability to walk. "You must keep those boots forever," his mother said. "You must preserve them. They are sacred now." "They are tools," his father countered, more practical. "Tools should be used. That is how you honor a tool, by using it well." But even he agreed that the boots were special, that they represented something larger than footwear, that they carried a story worth preserving. Moretti wore the boots through the hard years of Italian reconstruction. He wore them working in the olive groves, pruning the damaged trees, nursing them back to productivity. He wore them when he walked to the village market to sell oil and vegetables. He wore them when he married in 1948, when he became a father in 1949, when his own son took his first steps in 1950. The boots lasted nearly 10 years before the leather finally gave out, the soles wearing through, the seams splitting beyond repair. Even then he kept them, storing them wrapped in cloth in a trunk in the attic, taking them out occasionally to show his children, to tell them the story of the American nurse and her brother who died at Anzio, to explain that kindness could exist even in war, especially in war, when kindness was rarest and most needed. "Dear Nurse Callahan, I am leaving soon to Italy. I want to thank you for the boots you give me. Because of the boots, I can walk. Because I can walk, I can work. Because I can work, I can live. When I arrive at my home in Salerno, I will tell my mother and father about the American nurse who give me boots that belong to her brother. I will tell them that Americans are people of great generosity, that they help even their enemies when those enemies are suffering. I will remember your brother Thomas, who died in my country. I will pray for him. I will pray for you. I will wear the boots with honor until they are broken, and then I will keep them still as a memory of kindness in a time of war. With respect and gratitude, Giuseppe Moretti." He gave the letter to Margaret on October 17th, his last full day in the camp. She read it standing in the hospital ward while he waited, his expression nervous, uncertain of her reaction. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her uniform, next to the space where Thomas's letter had been, which she no longer needed to carry because its words had been absorbed into her memory, into her bones. She looked at Moretti for a long moment, this young man who had survived when so many had not, who would carry a piece of Thomas back to Italy, who had become an unexpected vehicle for her grief, to transform into something other than pure loss. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Walk carefully. Live well. That's the best way to honor him. To live well." Moretti nodded. He wanted to say more, to express the complicated gratitude he felt, to explain that the boots were more than just footwear, that they represented everything he had learned about America, about abundance and generosity, and the strange ways that enemies could become something else when circumstances shifted. But his English was inadequate to the task, and perhaps no language would have been sufficient. So he simply said, "I will live well. I promise this." The next morning, he boarded a train with 400 other Italian prisoners, all of them carrying duffel bags and wearing their American-issue clothing, all of them heading east toward the coast, toward the ships that would carry them home. Moretti wore the boots for the journey, feeling their familiar weight, their solid protection. His feet still hurt. They would always hurt, the doctors had told him. Nerve damage from the frostbite would persist for life. But the pain was manageable, tolerable, a small price for mobility. He watched Colorado pass by the train windows, the mountains giving way to plains, the plains stretching endlessly toward a horizon that seemed to promise everything and nothing. In New York, the prisoners were processed through a military embarkation center, their documents checked, their health assessed one final time, their belongings inventoried. A young clerk looked at Moretti's boots and whistled appreciatively. "Nice boots," he said. "American-made. Good quality. You get those at the PX?" Moretti did not know what a PX was, but he understood the question. "A gift," he said carefully, "from the nurse. At hospital." The clerk nodded and marked something on his form. "You're lucky," he said. "Italian boots are shit. These'll last you years." The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was a converted troop transport, crowded and uncomfortable, but adequate. The Italian prisoners clustered on deck during the day, watching the ocean pass, smoking cigarettes that were suddenly precious again because they would not be easily replaced in Italy, talking about what they would find when they arrived. Many had not received letters from their families in months. The Italian postal system had collapsed during the civil war between Mussolini's Repubblica Sociale and the Allied-backed government in the South. The prisoners did not know if their houses still stood, if their families had survived the fighting and the reprisals and the hunger. They were sailing toward uncertainty, toward a country that existed more in memory than in current reality. Moretti stood at the rail and thought about his father's olive trees, wondering if they had survived. Olive trees were resilient. They could live for centuries, could survive drought and neglect and even fire. But armies were hard on trees. Soldiers cut them for firewood when they were cold. Artillery fire shattered them. Tanks crushed them. He remembered the olive groves outside Tunis, ancient trees that had produced oil since Roman times, reduced to splintered stumps by the fighting. He tried not to imagine the same fate for his father's trees, but the imagination was difficult to control. The ship docked in Naples on November 8, 1945. The harbor was busy with military traffic, American supply ships unloading food and medicine and construction materials, Italian fishing boats trying to resume their trade. The city beyond the docks looked both familiar and alien. The same architecture, the same mountains in the background, but scarred now by bombing. Whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the population visibly thinner, more desperate than Moretti remembered. The prisoners disembarked and were processed through a repatriation center, given documents that certified their status, provided with temporary ration cards that would allow them to draw from Allied supplies until they could return to their home communities. Moretti made his way south along the coast road, sometimes walking, sometimes catching rides on military trucks or civilian carts, moving through a landscape that bore the marks of war like scars on skin. Bridges were destroyed, towns were gutted, fields that should have been planted lay fallow, the farmers dead or displaced or simply lacking the tools and seed to resume cultivation. But the land itself remained, the volcanic soil rich and dark, the climate mild and generous, the sun bright overhead. Italy had been defeated, occupied, dismembered, but it had not been destroyed. It would recover. It would take years, perhaps decades, but it would recover. He arrived at his family's farm 3 days after landing in Naples, walking the final kilometers up the hill road as evening fell. The house was still standing, smoke rising from the chimney. The olive trees remained, though several showed damage from shell fragments, their trunks scarred but alive. His mother was drawing water from the well when she saw him, and she dropped the bucket and screamed, a sound of pure joy that brought his father running from the barn. They embraced him with desperate intensity, touching his face, his arms, his chest, verifying that he was real, that he had survived, that he had come home. That night, sitting at the kitchen table eating bread and thin soup, the best his mother could provide, given the scarcity of food, Moretti told them about America, about the prison camp in the mountains, about the frostbite that had nearly cost him his feet, about the boots. His mother wept when he told her about Margaret Callahan, about the nurse whose brother had died at Anzio, who had given him boots that had saved his ability to walk. "You must keep those boots forever," his mother said. "You must preserve them. They are sacred now." "They are tools," his father countered, more practical. "Tools should be used. That is how you honor a tool, by using it well." But even he agreed that the boots were special, that they represented something larger than footwear, that they carried a story worth preserving. Moretti wore the boots through the hard years of Italian reconstruction. He wore them working in the olive groves, pruning the damaged trees, nursing them back to productivity. He wore them when he walked to the village market to sell oil and vegetables. He wore them when he married in 1948, when he became a father in 1949, when his own son took his first steps in 1950. The boots lasted nearly 10 years before the leather finally gave out, the soles wearing through, the seams splitting beyond repair. Even then he kept them, storing them wrapped in cloth in a trunk in the attic, taking them out occasionally to show his children, to tell them the story of the American nurse and her brother who died at Anzio, to explain that kindness could exist even in war, especially in war, when kindness was rarest and most needed.